Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 198, Io Conclusions. Now we've finished reading Io, it's time to conclude what the dialogue is about, and this is going to be a problem, partly because the dialogue, it seems to me, is so short. It's only about 11 Stephanus pages long, which is very short for any Platonic dialogue. Perhaps we should start by saying what the dialogue is not. Many Platonists pass over this dialogue altogether because it's so short, and later dialogues seem to deal with the same subject matter in more detail. For example, the criticism of poetry is something found in later dialogues and in much more detail. And Platonists, being Platonists, assume that this is Plato criticizing poetry. A close reading of Politeia, for example, Republic, shows that it's not Plato who's saying anything about poetry. It is Socrates who is talking to Adimantus and Glauco and trying to get them to react dialectically to what he is saying. Of course, they never do react dialectically. They just like to listen to all the stories he makes up for them. So we should think twice before assuming that this dialogue, Io, is a criticism of poetry. If there is criticism, what could this criticism be? The only thing I can see is that assuming that knowledge and understanding, or techne, or episteme, assuming that these are good things, then denying them to Io would appear to be a criticism of Io, which is fair enough if that were the case. Now, Socrates does say that he thinks Io doesn't have a techne, but he only says this after Io himself says that he doesn't understand why he enthuses about Homer, but not about other poets. And Socrates brings up the spurious claim that someone with techne would know everything about every poet. This is complete nonsense. And Io himself protests that he has done a lot of work. He has memorized thousands of lines. He does have a techne. And Socrates doesn't actually disprove that. The attempts at refutation are only apparent. Socrates begins with 3 analogies to show that the rhapsodist has nothing in his head when he is a rhapsode. In fact, he goes all the way to the poets. Even the poets themselves have no understanding of what they're talking about. We have the magnet analogy by which the muse, Clio, who is responsible for epic poetry, somehow infuses the poet with her power, like a magnet. She's the magnet, he becomes magnetized. And then the rhapsode in his turn is magnetized by the poet. In other words, he receives divine power of some sort. And then, through the rhapsode, the audience gain divine power. They are magnetized by the rhapsode. This is an analogy. It is not a philosophical argument at all, and it doesn't refute anything. The next fanciful analogy is that the poets have to make themselves lighter in order to fly up to the Garden of the Muses. So the thing that they get rid of is their nous, their mind, their intelligence, and they go up to the Garden of the Muse like a bee, and there they find poems, ready-made, just like honey. We would say pollen. In other words, they do absolutely nothing. They are not the ones who composed the poetry, but they find it, bring it back down, and then the rhapsodes learn it. This is complete nonsense. Everyone knows it. Poets do not simply go into a coma and begin reciting verses. That is not how poets compose poetry. And the rhapsodes have to sit and learn lines of poetry. It's hard work. Then we have straight possession, whereby the goddess speaks through the rhapsode. This, again, can't be right. Io himself thinks that none of these analogies actually make sense. He knows how much work he's done, and he does protest about it. We would have to wonder why Plato would bother writing that into the dialogue. If he really wanted to prove, as it were, that the poets and rhapsodes are lacking a techne because they lack understanding, he would not have had Io protest. He would have said, Io would have said, "Oh yes, Socrates, I see what you mean now. Of course, that's how it is." The second half of the dialogue develops something that was said before the divine part of the dialogue, that a rhapsode lacks the specializing techne that other people have for any particular part of the poem, whichever poem it is. If Io thinks he can interpret a piece of poetry correctly, there's always some expert who can interpret better than him. Indeed, Socrates gives Io the opportunity at every point to say that he, the rhapsode, is actually better than the expert. But Io himself always chooses the expert. He is not claiming that he is an expert on the content of the poetry. Furthermore, on the very first page of the dialogue, Socrates exclaims how he envies the rhapsodes their techne, because they can dress up and look as fine as possible. And this is already a strong indication that the techne of the rhapsode is performative. He doesn't actually have to understand the details of the content of what is being said by the various speakers in the poem. He needs to understand the general drift. He needs to be able to convey fear, pity, grief, happiness, whatever the poet obviously meant the people to feel. It doesn't matter how one makes a salve for a wound. It doesn't matter how a fish hook drops down into the river. It doesn't matter how you lead soldiers into battle. This is simply a poem. It's not a treatise on actual professions. And this is a point where Io is made to make a mistake. Socrates is the one who keeps pushing Io to think that he might be an expert at the content of the poetry. When Io originally considered himself to be able to interpret Homer better than anybody else, and he had reason to believe that because he keeps winning prizes in competitions, when Io thought like that, he didn't think that he was an expert at all the subject matter. He was just very good at conveying whatever was being said in the way that the speaker should have been saying it. It's because Socrates kept comparing between the rhapsode and experts in various fields, and with Io agreeing that the experts in various fields are more likely to interpret correctly the content of those fields, it came to the point where there was only one techne left, and Io felt, apparently, that if he allowed the expert to have that techne as well, then he would indeed not have a techne himself. We're talking about the strategos. So Io then said, because he is a rhapsode with the techne of the rhapsode, he also has the techne of the strategos. Before this conversation, I doubt that Io would have said such a thing, and I'm aware I'm talking about a time before this dialogue. I do not believe that this has anything to do with the historical Io. I'm talking about the character in this dialogue made up by Plato. This Io himself would not have said such a thing. The obvious question after that would be, why then has Socrates pushed Io all the way to becoming so desperate that he thought that he should say that he is a strategos because he is a rhapsodos? I suspect that Socrates has been trying all along to make Io understand what sort of techne he has. Socrates is not denying that Io has a techne, but he thinks, and correctly apparently, that Io doesn't understand what his techne is, where the limits are. The limits of his techne are in the performative arts. He dresses up and he speaks and moves his arms about, that sort of thing. That's what he is good at. What he is not good at, and this is where he gets a bit confused, is understanding Homer. Io does understand how to perform Homer's poetry, but he may be confused into thinking that he therefore understands the content itself, probably because Homer himself is considered to be an expert on the content of his poetry.